The millionaire laughed as the judge ended the divorce trial. He had won everything: money, control, silence. Then, without raising his voice, her father stood up holding a single document. The courtroom froze. In that moment, the victory shattered, and a truth long buried finally demanded attention. Before we go any further, take a breath with me. Stories like this aren't just about what happens in a courtroom. They're about the quiet moments that shape who we become. If you're watching tonight, it means something in you still believes in fairness, in growth, in people choosing better. This channel is a place to feel, not rush. If this story already touched you, leave a kind word or a simple thought in the comments. Every voice here matters. The sound that filled the courtroom wasn't applause. It was softer than that, sharper. A thin ripple of murmurs, shoes shifting against polished wood, the faint rustle of expensive fabric as people leaned toward one another, hungry to confirm what they already believed they just witnessed. The judge's voice had barely finished echoing when the millionaire let out a breath that turned into a smile, then into something dangerously close to a laugh. Not loud, never loud. He didn't need that. His confidence did the talking for him. He straightened in his chair, rolled his shoulders back, and adjusted his cufflinks as if he were preparing for a board meeting instead of the end of a divorce trial. A legal victory like this deserved composure, control, the kind of calm that said he had known the outcome long before anyone else did. Around him, his attorneys exchanged satisfied glances, already packing folders, already thinking about press releases and next steps. The divorce trial was over. On paper, at least, everything had gone exactly as planned. Across the aisle, his ex-wife didn't move. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral to the point of being unreadable. No tears, no shaking breath, no visible collapse. To most people in the room, that stillness looked like shock, like defeat finally sinking in. The millionaire noticed it too, and misread it instantly, the way he misread most silences that didn't serve him. He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one studies a closed door after finding the key already in hand. Whatever strength she thought she had brought into this courtroom had been stripped away by procedure, precedent, and his far superior legal team. This was what winning sounded like. Not cheers, not celebration, just inevitability. The judge gathered her papers, expression professional, detached. The ruling had been clear. Assets divided according to disclosed records. No spousal claims beyond what had already been negotiated. No further obligations. Clean, efficient, final. The kind of legal victory that made men like him believe the system worked exactly as intended, especially when they knew how to use it. He leaned toward his lead attorney and whispered something under his breath, a private comment that made the man smile tightly in return. Probably something dismissive. Maybe a joke. Maybe a remark about how unnecessary the last few months had been, how predictable the outcome always was. Arrogance had a way of disguising itself as certainty, and the millionaire wore it well. Behind them, seated several rows back, her father rose halfway from his chair, then stopped. It wasn't traumatic. No one noticed. No one was supposed to. He stood there for a brief moment, tall but unassuming, his posture straight despite his age, his expression calm to the point of indifference. He surveyed the room quietly, not looking at the judge, not looking at the lawyers, but at his daughter. Just long enough to meet her eyes. She gave the smallest nod in response, so subtle it could have been missed entirely by anyone not searching for it. Then he sat back down. The millionaire didn't see any of this. He was already mentally leaving the courtroom, already imagining the next call he would make, the next celebration that would inevitably follow. He pictured champagne glasses clinking somewhere upscale and private, conversations full of reassurances about how cleanly he had handled things. He imagined telling the story later, shaping it into another example of his competence, his dominance, his ability to win, even when emotions were involved. Courtroom silence followed the judge's exit, thick and heavy, the kind that always came after something final. People began to stand. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. A few observers glanced toward the ex-wife, expecting some kind of reaction, some visible sign of loss. She remained seated for a moment longer, eyes forward, breathing slow and controlled. If she felt anything, she didn't show it. That, too, was misinterpreted. To the millionaire, it looked like resignation. He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket, and turned slightly in her direction. Not fully, just enough to be seen. Enough to remind her who had won. Their eyes met briefly, and in his there was something smug, something final. A look that said the legal victory was also a personal one, that the chapter was closed, whether she was ready or not. She didn't look away. She didn't react at all. That unsettled him, but only for a second. One of his attorneys touched his arm lightly, guiding him toward the aisle. "We're done here," the man murmured, voice low, satisfied. "You handled it well." The millionaire nodded. He liked hearing that. He liked the way it sounded simple, contained, resolved. He took a step forward, then another, moving with the confidence of someone who believed consequences were for other people. As he passed the bench where his ex-wife still sat, he paused just long enough to deliver a quiet line meant only for her. "It didn't have to be this hard," he said, voice smooth, almost generous. She finally turned her head fully toward him then. Her eyes were steady, clear, not angry, not broken. Something else flickered there, something he didn't recognize, and therefore dismissed. She didn't respond. Not a word. Not even a breath out of place. Silence again. He scoffed softly and continued walking. Behind him, her father stood this time without hesitation. Still no theatrics, no announcement. Just the simple act of rising, as if responding to a cue no one else could hear. He picked up a slim briefcase from beneath the bench, its leather worn but well cared for, and held it at his side. He did not follow immediately. He waited, letting the millionaire and his entourage exit first, letting the sound of their footsteps fade. Only then did he step into the aisle. The ex-wife stood as well, smoothing her coat, her movements measured, composed. She glanced back once, just once, toward the front of the courtroom where the judge had sat moments earlier. Then she turned toward her father. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no nod, no signal. Just understanding. Outside the courtroom doors, the millionaire laughed openly now, the sound bouncing off marble walls. Phones came out. Messages were typed. Arrangements were made. The divorce trial was already becoming a story he would tell from the position of a man who had won everything worth winning. Inside, the courtroom settled back into stillness. The father adjusted his grip on the briefcase and exhaled slowly through his nose. He did not look angry. He did not look pleased. He looked patient, as if the real proceedings hadn't started yet. And for the first time that morning, though he didn't know it, the millionaire had misjudged the sound of winning. If anyone in that courtroom believed the divorce trial had truly begun that morning, they would have been wrong. The real battle had started months earlier, far from polished benches and legal jargon, in places where no court reporter had been present, and no ruling could capture what was being taken piece by piece. What the court saw was the final act. What it didn't see was the slow erosion that led there, deliberate and methodical, powered by arrogance disguised as intelligence. The millionaire had decided how the divorce would unfold long before the first filing. To him, it wasn't personal. That was the excuse he repeated whenever anyone dared suggest otherwise. It was strategy, efficiency, control. He had learned early in his career that whoever exhausted the other side first usually won, and he treated marriage the same way he treated hostile takeovers. overwhelm them financially, keep them reacting, never let them settle long enough to organize. He hired the most aggressive legal team money could buy, not because the case was complex, but because intimidation worked best when it was excessive. Motions were filed late on Fridays. Hearings were pushed back, then suddenly rescheduled. Requests for documents came in waves, always just enough to keep pressure high, but never enough to close the door. Each move was calculated to drain energy, time, and confidence. To him, it was almost elegant. His ex-wife noticed immediately. She noticed the way letters arrived thicker each week, the language colder, sharper. She noticed how every phone call with her own attorney ended with the same phrase, "We'll need more time." Time she didn't have. Money she wasn't supposed to spend. Nights that stretched longer as sleep became optional and anxiety became routine. The millionaire, meanwhile, slept just fine. What he never bothered to notice was how little she fought back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show up unannounced. She didn't leak anything to the press or post vague messages online. To him, that silence confirmed his assumptions. She was overwhelmed, lost, waiting for mercy that wasn't coming. He mistook restraint for weakness, forgetting that silence could also be a form of calculation. Her father watched all of this from a distance. He never interfered directly, never called the millionaire, never argued with lawyers or demanded explanations. To anyone observing casually, he seemed like a background figure, an aging man who sat quietly during meetings and asked few questions. The millionaire barely acknowledged him at all, and when he did, it was with polite dismissal. Old men without visible wealth were rarely threats in his world. What he didn't see were the meetings that happened after midnight in modest offices, or the calls made from landlines instead of cell phones. He didn't hear the father asking the same question over and over, calmly, patiently, to different professionals. What hasn't been disclosed? What was assumed instead of proven? What was taken for granted because no one thought to look? During one particularly brutal week, when 3 separate filings arrived within 48 hours, the ex-wife finally broke her silence. Not publicly, not in court. She sat across from her father at a small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "I can't keep up," she admitted quietly. "Every time I think I understand the divorce trial, they change the rules." Her father nodded, listening without interrupting. "He's celebrating already," she added. "He thinks this is over." The father didn't correct her. He simply asked, "And do you?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I feel like I'm always behind." "That's because you're being made to look backward," he said evenly. "The court only sees what's put in front of it. And right now, that's exactly what he wants." She stared at him, confused. "So what do we do?" For the first time, he smiled faintly. "We stop reacting." From that moment on, something shifted, not outwardly. The filings continued. The pressure didn't ease. The millionaire grew more confident with every passing week, mistaking her lack of counterattacks as surrender. But behind closed doors, her father began mapping everything the court didn't see. Not emotions, not grievances, structures, patterns, gaps. He knew men like the millionaire. He had worked around them decades earlier, long before flashy branding and social media arrogance had become common. Back then, power hid in paperwork and patience, not headlines. The father had learned early that the most dangerous leverage was the kind no one thought to look for. As the divorce trial approached its final weeks, the millionaire became careless. He bragged openly about how clean the case was, how airtight his disclosures had been. He mocked the idea that anything substantial could surface so late in the process. His lawyers reassured him constantly. Everything had been disclosed. Everything relevant, at least. The father listened to those reassurances through second-hand reports and said nothing. On the morning of the final hearing, as the ex-wife dressed in silence, She paused in the doorway and turned to him. "If this doesn't work," she said softly, "I don't know what comes next." He looked at her calmly. "What comes next doesn't depend on today," he replied. "Today just determines how surprised he's going to be later." In the courtroom, the millionaire strutted with confidence, convinced the legal victory was already his. He didn't notice the father arrive early and sit farther back than usual. He didn't notice the briefcase resting at the man's feet, placed carefully, deliberately. He certainly didn't notice the way the father watched the judge, more than the proceedings, as if measuring timing rather than outcome. When the ruling came down, the millionaire felt validated. Everything he believed about power and arrogance seemed confirmed. The divorce trial ended exactly how he had predicted. He laughed, he whispered, he stood tall. And while the court recorded the end of one case, it failed to capture the quiet truth unfolding just beyond its narrow lens. The ex-wife didn't cry because she hadn't lost anything she couldn't recover. The father didn't react because the real leverage had never been meant for that room. And the millionaire, basking in what he believed was a legal victory, walked away convinced that nothing remained hidden. He had no idea how much the court hadn't seen. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you were in his place, would you feel untouchable right now, or uneasy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Rate the story so far from 0 to 10. And if you're enjoying it, like the video and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like this alive until the very end. The millionaire left the courthouse with the kind of likeness that only came from certainty. Not relief, not gratitude, but certainty. His steps were measured, confident, and he didn't bother hiding the small smile that curved his mouth as he crossed the marble hall. People noticed. They always did. A few nodded at him, some with respect, others with curiosity, and he accepted it all as confirmation that the divorce trial had ended exactly the way it was supposed to. He paused briefly at the doors, adjusted his jacket, and inhaled deeply, as if breathing in a future that suddenly felt uncomplicated. Outside, his phone vibrated almost immediately. One message, then another, then several more, piling up faster than he cared to read them. Congratulations. Short voice notes full of approval. One from a colleague joking that drinks were on him tonight. Another from an old friend who hadn't checked in for months, but suddenly remembered his number. Victory had that effect on people. It reminded them where to attach themselves. He smiled down at the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket, already knowing how the rest of the day would unfold. He didn't go back to the office. There was no need. Instead, he called his assistant from the back seat of the car and gave a single instruction. Clear my afternoon. Book the lounge. The private one. His tone made it sound like a favor, not an order, but they both knew the difference. By the time the car merged into traffic, arrangements were already in motion. The lounge sat above the city, hidden behind frosted glass and discretion. No signage, no crowds. Just low lighting, leather seating, and staff trained to recognize money without needing introductions. When the millionaire arrived, the room was empty, quiet except for soft music humming from unseen speakers. He liked that. It felt like a reward reserved just for him. He chose the seat with the best view and ordered champagne without looking at the menu. The first guests arrived less than an hour later. His lawyers came together, relaxed now, ties loosened, jackets draped casually over chairs. They laughed easily, already discussing upcoming vacations, deals put on hold until the divorce trial concluded. To them, this case had been just another notch in their careers. A clean win, efficient. They raised their glasses the moment they sat down. To the end of unnecessary complications, one of them said. The millionaire clinked his glass against theirs. To knowing how to play the game. As more people filtered in, the energy shifted. Conversations overlapped. Laughter grew louder. Someone ordered another round. The millionaire settled into his role effortlessly, recounting moments from the trial, as if telling a story that had always been destined to end this way. He spoke about the judge's tone, the predictability of the ruling, the satisfaction of watching things fall into place. Each word reinforced his belief that control was permanent if you were smart enough to secure it. "She never stood a chance," he said at one point, swirling his drink. You could see it in her face. One of the associates nodded, though he hadn't actually been there. Some people just aren't built for pressure. The millionaire shrugged, pretending indifference. "It's not about strength. It's about resources." No one argued. They rarely did. What none of them noticed was how quickly the laughter died when he wasn't speaking. The pauses lingered longer than they should have. The room filled with sound, but not warmth. It was celebration without depth, movement without meaning. Echoes that faded the moment the source stopped talking. Across the city, his ex-wife sat quietly in the passenger seat of her father's car, watching buildings pass by in silence. The city looked unchanged, indifferent. Traffic lights turned red and green as usual. Pedestrians crossed streets without knowing a legal battle had just ended nearby. She pressed her hands together in her lap, not in prayer, but to ground herself. She felt oddly calm, not happy, not devastated, just suspended, as if standing on the edge of something that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Her father drove without rushing. He didn't check his phone. He didn't speak until they were several blocks away. "He's celebrating," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "Yes," he replied. "He believes the noise means the story is over." She stared out the window. "And it's not?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned down a narrower street, one she didn't recognize. "Stories don't end when someone decides they do," he said at last. "They end when there's nothing left unresolved." Back at the lounge, the millionaire leaned closer to one of his lawyers, lowering his voice as if sharing something confidential. "The funny thing," he said, smirking, "is that she probably thinks staying quiet made her look dignified." The lawyer smiled politely. "Silence can be strategic." The millionaire laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Only when you have something to hide." He didn't realize how ironic that sounded. As evening crept closer, the champagne bottles multiplied. Conversations blurred together. Someone suggested moving the celebration somewhere louder, more public, but the millionaire waved the idea away. He liked the control of this space. He liked knowing exactly who was present. He liked that no one would interrupt with inconvenient questions. When his phone buzzed again, he checked it absently. Still no message from his ex-wife. He took that as confirmation. Acceptance looked a lot like silence in his experience. He leaned back, stretching his legs, and felt the comfortable weight of certainty settle over him again. Meanwhile, in a quiet office filled with old shelves and newer locks, the father placed his briefcase on a desk and opened it carefully. He didn't rush. Inside, documents lay stacked neatly, some clipped, others bound. Each page had been chosen for a reason. Each signature told a story the court had not heard. The ex-wife stood nearby, watching his movements with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "You're sure this wasn't supposed to be submitted earlier?" she asked softly. He shook his head. Too early, and it would have been buried. Too late, and it would have been dismissed. Timing is everything. She nodded slowly, trusting him more than she trusted the silence that surrounded them. Back at the lounge, the celebration began to thin. Guests left in pairs and small groups, offering final congratulations, promising to follow up soon. The millionaire accepted every handshake, every smile, confident that this chapter had closed cleanly. When only a few people remained, he paid the bill himself, insisting on it as a final assertion of control. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt satisfied, light, victorious. The city stretched before him, unaware and unconcerned. He took a deep breath and smiled, unaware that while he celebrated without echo, the quiet he had mistaken for defeat was already moving, already aligning itself, preparing to speak at exactly the wrong moment for him. The father had spent most of his life being underestimated, and long ago he learned not only to tolerate it, but to cultivate it. People spoke more freely when they believed you were harmless. They overlooked details when they assumed you no longer mattered. Age helped. Silence helped more. As he sat in the modest office that evening, the hum of an old ceiling fan circling lazily above him, he arranged documents with the same patience he applied to everything else. There was no urgency in his movements, no visible tension, only focus. The kind that came from knowing exactly where a story was headed, even if others had already stopped paying attention. His daughter watched him from across the room, still wearing the same coat she had left the courthouse an hours earlier. She hadn't taken it off yet, as if removing it might make everything feel too real. "I still don't understand how he missed all of this," she said quietly, gesturing toward the papers spread across the desk. "His lawyers went through everything." The father smiled faintly, not amused, but thoughtful. "They went through what they were given," he replied, "and what they assumed was complete." He tapped one document gently with his finger. That's where arrogance does most of its damage. It convinces smart people they've already seen everything worth seeing. She moved closer, scanning the pages. Most of it was legal language she barely recognized, references to entities that sounded distant and abstract. Trusts, holdings, clauses buried deep beneath layers of compliance. "You've been holding on to this for a long time," she said. "Yes," he answered simply. "Because some things only matter when someone believes they no longer do." Years earlier, long before the divorce trial was even a possibility, the father had learned how men like the millionaire built their power. He had watched them rise through systems that rewarded confidence over caution, speed over reflection. He had advised companies quietly, helped structure deals no one wanted their name attached to publicly. And in that world, he learned a simple truth. What wasn't flashy was often what mattered most. When his daughter married the millionaire, he had been polite, cordial, reserved. He shook hands, smiled for photos, and said little. He had seen the ambition behind the charm, the hunger masked as generosity. He hadn't objected, not because he approved, but because he understood something his daughter didn't yet need to know. You didn't protect people by controlling their choices. You protected them by preparing for consequences. So when the marriage began to fracture, he paid attention. Not to arguments or emotional fallout, but to patterns. To shifts in financial behavior. To the way certain assets moved quietly, repositioned under the guise of efficiency. He noticed what the millionaire assumed no one would ever question, and he filed it away. "I didn't want to interfere," the father said now, stacking one folder neatly atop another. "Not until it was necessary," the ex-wife exhaled slowly. "And now it is." "Yes," he said, "because he believes the legal victory is final, and that belief makes him careless." The room fell silent again, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, traffic passed, unaware of the careful recalibration happening inside. The father closed the briefcase and latched it securely. "Tomorrow," he said calmly, "we go back." Her eyes widened slightly. "Back? To the courthouse?" He nodded. "Not for another trial, not yet. Just to make sure the right doors stay open." The next morning, the millionaire woke with a sense of satisfaction that bordered on smugness. Sunlight spilled through his bedroom windows, illuminating a city that felt firmly under his control. He checked his phone before getting out of bed, scanning headlines, emails, messages. Nothing alarming. Nothing unexpected. He smiled to himself. The world had accepted his version of events without question. At the courthouse, the father arrived early again. He sat in the same place, farther back than anyone else, blending into the background. Clerks moved around him, exchanging paperwork, speaking in low voices. When one of them glanced his way, he offered a polite nod and nothing more. He had learned long ago that familiarity bred curiosity, and curiosity bred resistance. Better to remain unremarkable. The ex-wife joined him quietly. "Do you ever wonder?" she asked softly. "What would have happened if I'd tried to fight him head-on?" The father considered this. "You would have exhausted yourself," he said honestly, "and he would have enjoyed it." She nodded. That sounded right. Across town, the millionaire walked into his office to congratulations from staff who had followed the divorce trial closely. Handshakes, smiles, quiet reassurances. He accepted them all, basking in the aftermath of his win. His confidence was absolute no. He believed the silence from the other side meant surrender. He believed the story was done. He had no idea that the man he barely remembered from the courtroom had just ensured it wasn't. By mid-morning, a clerk made a call she didn't usually make. A file was flagged. A note was reviewed. Nothing dramatic. Just procedure. The father waited calmly, hands folded, briefcase at his feet. He had waited much longer for much less. When the phone rang, he answered without hesitation. His voice was steady, respectful. "Yes," he said, "we're available." He hung up and looked at his daughter. "It won't be today," he said, "but soon." She searched his face. "Are you sure?" He met her gaze evenly. "I wouldn't have stood up yesterday if I wasn't." For the first time since the divorce trial ended, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not revenge. Something steadier, something grounded. And somewhere else in the city, the millionaire signed off on another deal, completely unaware that the man everyone misjudged had just set the stage for a silence that would soon be impossible to ignore. Silence did not arrive all at once. It crept in gradually, unnoticed at first, settling into spaces the millionaire never bothered to inspect. The morning after his celebration, he woke later than usual, head clear, confidence intact. The divorce trial was behind him. The legal victory was sealed. His schedule reflected that certainty, packed with meetings that assumed stability, not disruption. He moved through his routine with ease, greeting assistants, responding to emails, approving decisions without hesitation. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It wasn't until mid-morning that the first interruption came, subtle enough to be dismissed. His chief financial officer stood in the doorway of his office longer than necessary, tablet in hand, expression carefully neutral. The millionaire noticed, but only because he was used to reading people for advantage. "Something?" he asked casually, barely looking up. "Just a small procedural issue," the CFO replied. One of the banks flagged a transfer for additional review. The millionaire waved a hand dismissively. "Routine." "Handle it." The CFO nodded, but didn't leave immediately. That hesitation lingered in the air, faint but uncomfortable. When he finally exited, the millionaire felt a brief irritation he couldn't quite place. He shrugged it off. Banks asked questions. That was their job. By lunchtime, a second interruption arrived. His legal assistant called to confirm an appointment that had already been confirmed the week before. The repetition annoyed him. He prided himself on efficiency. Still, he corrected her politely and returned to his work. Across town, the ex-wife sat in a quiet waiting room beside her father, hands folded neatly, posture calm. The room was unremarkable, painted in neutral tones, furnished with chairs meant to discourage lingering. A clock ticked steadily on the wall. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Silence had become their language now, measured and deliberate. Her phone buzzed once. She checked it, then looked up at her father. "They're starting to notice," she said quietly. He nodded. "Good." Back in his office, the millionaire stared at his inbox, brow furrowed. A message from one of his asset managers, sat unread longer than it should have. The subject line was vague, carefully worded. He opened it, scanned the contents, then read it again more slowly. It referenced a review. Not a problem, not a crisis. A review. The word irritated him. Reviews happened before deals closed, not after legal victories. He picked up his phone and dialed the number immediately. It rang longer than expected before someone answered. The conversation was brief, professional, unsatisfying, nothing concrete. Just reassurances and vague explanations about compliance. He ended the call with a tight smile that faded as soon as the screen went dark. Something was off. Still, he told himself, silence meant nothing. Silence was empty. He had always believed that. If there were a real issue, it would announce itself loudly. Demands, accusations, threats. That was how problems behaved. Not like this. In the courthouse, a clerk walked briskly down a corridor, carrying a thin folder that hadn't been there the day before. She stopped at a door, marked with an official seal, and knocked twice. Inside, a judge glanced up from her desk, surprised but attentive. The clerk handed over the folder without comment. Procedure. Nothing more. The father sat nearby, hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes lowered. He did not watch the exchange. He didn't need to. That afternoon, the millionaire's phone rang again. This time, it was his lawyer. The man's voice sounded different than it had during the celebration. Less relaxed, more careful. There's been a development, the lawyer said. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, irritation flaring. What kind of development? Nothing dramatic, the lawyer replied quickly. But the court requested clarification on a late submission. The millionaire frowned. Late submission? From who? There was a pause. Not from us. His confidence wavered, just slightly. Then ignore it. We can't, the lawyer said. It's already been logged. The call ended with promises to follow up. The millionaire stared at his desk for a long moment afterward, fingers drumming against the surface. He didn't like this feeling. It wasn't fear yet. It was annoyance. The kind that came when something refused to behave as expected. Across the city, the ex-wife exhaled slowly as her father checked his watch. They'll call him back, he said calmly. Not today, but soon, she nodded. And if he panics? He won't, the father replied. Not yet. He still thinks silence means nothing. The silence thickened as the day wore on. Emails arrived with slightly altered tones. Meetings ended without the usual assurances. People hesitated before answering questions they would normally respond to instantly. The millionaire noticed every change, every pause, every deviation from routine. His mind raced to fill the gaps, but without clear information, there was nothing to attack. That night, he poured himself a drink and stood by the window of his apartment, city lights flickering below. He replayed the last 24 hours in his head, searching for a mistake he could correct. He found none. The divorce trial was over. The legal victory was real. Everything had been disclosed. He had followed the rules. The silence didn't make sense. He checked his phone one last time before bed. No messages from his ex-wife. No demands. No threats. Just emptiness. He set the phone down, uneasy, unaware that the silence he dismissed so easily was already doing exactly what it was meant to do. The call came just after noon, slipping into the millionaire's day like a hairline fracture in glass. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no urgent language. Just a request, delivered politely, wrapped in procedural phrasing that made it sound optional when it wasn't. The court required a brief reconvening, a clarification, a matter of record. The kind of thing that usually took minutes and meant nothing. He scoffed when his lawyer relayed it. They're fishing, he said, already reaching for his jacket. Let's get it over with. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, His irritation had replaced whatever unease lingered from the morning. The building looked the same. The marble floors reflected the overhead lights. The air smelled faintly of polish and paper. Familiar territory. This was where he had won. He nodded at a security officer who recognized him, straightened his shoulders, and walked in with the confidence of a man returning to a stage he believed he owned. Inside the courtroom, a few people were already seated. Fewer than before. No audience. No press. Just clerks, lawyers, and the quiet hum of expectation. His ex-wife sat near the front, hands folded, posture composed. She didn't look at him. Her father sat farther back, exactly where he had been before, his briefcase resting at his feet. The millionaire noticed him only in passing. A flicker of recognition, nothing more. He took his seat beside his lawyer, leaned back, crossed his arms. This would be quick. The judge entered without ceremony. No preamble. She acknowledged the room and immediately addressed the matter at hand. A document was submitted late, she said calmly. Its relevance requires clarification. The millionaire exhaled sharply through his nose. Late submissions were common, rarely consequential. He glanced at his lawyer, who nodded subtly, as if to say this was under control. Who submitted it? The millionaire asked quietly. The lawyer hesitated. Not us. The judge continued, I'd like the submitting party to stand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the father rose. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. The scrape of his chair against the floor sounded louder than it should have in the hushed room. He stood straight, hands relaxed at his sides, expression neutral. No anger, no triumph, just presence. The millionaire frowned, confusion flickering across his face before irritation took its place. This is a joke, he muttered. The father stepped forward when directed, carrying the briefcase with him. He placed it on the clerk's desk and opened it slowly, removing a single document. He didn't speak until the judge acknowledged him. This document, the father said evenly, was not required during initial disclosures. Its relevance only became absolute once the ruling was issued. The judge accepted the document, scanned it, and looked up sharply. Her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The millionaire leaned forward now, attention fully engaged. What is this? He demanded, unable to stop himself. The judge raised a hand. You'll have an opportunity to respond. She turned back to the father. Why wasn't this brought forward earlier? Because timing matters, the father replied simply. And because its implications depend on finality. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. The judge reviewed the document again, slower this time. She exchanged a glance with the clerk, and with another official seated nearby. A quiet conversation followed, voices low, careful. The millionaire watched, jaw tightening, pulse quickening despite himself. His lawyer leaned toward him. I don't recognize this entity, he whispered, but the letterhead is concerning. The millionaire swallowed. He recognized it now. Or rather, he recognized the absence of it. The gap. The blind spot he had dismissed years ago as irrelevant. He had assumed it dissolved. He had never confirmed. That's impossible, he said under his breath. The judge cleared her throat. This document indicates that certain assets referenced in the divorce trial fall under a separate holding arrangement not previously addressed. The millionaire stood abruptly. Everything was disclosed, he snapped. Every relevant asset. The judge's gaze hardened. Sit down. He hesitated, then obeyed. The father remained standing, silent again, letting the words settle. The judge continued. Given the nature of this submission, the court must temporarily suspend the ruling pending review. A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable. The millionaire's world tilted. Suspend? He repeated. On what grounds? The judge met his eyes steadily. on the grounds that the court may not have had jurisdiction over all relevant interests at the time of ruling. His lawyer's face drained of color. The ex-wife finally looked at him then. Her expression wasn't smug. It wasn't vindictive. It was calm, grounded, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The father closed the briefcase and stepped back, returning to his seat without another word. The judge ordered a recess. The room froze, caught between disbelief and realization. The millionaire stood there, stunned, as the certainty he had wrapped himself in began to crack. He had walked back into the courtroom expecting closure. Instead, he found silence turning solid, pressing in from all sides, refusing to be ignored any longer. And for the first time since the divorce trial began, he understood that winning loudly meant nothing when the quiet had been working against him all along. The recess did not scatter the tension. It concentrated it. When the judge stepped out briefly, the courtroom did not relax the way it usually did during pauses. No one reached for their phone casually. No one whispered jokes or stretched their legs. The air felt heavier, compressed, as if everyone present understood they were standing on unstable ground. The millionaire remained by the counsel table, jacket still on, spine stiff, eyes fixed forward. His lawyers gathered close, speaking in low, urgent tones that no longer sounded confident, only precise and afraid of being overheard. What exactly did he submit? The millionaire asked for the third time, his voice sharper now, stripped of the earlier irritation and edging toward something closer to disbelief. His lead attorney hesitated, fingers tightening around a pen. "It's not just one document," he said carefully. "It's a chain, a holding structure, layered, dormant, but intact. It predates your marriage, yes, but it was never dissolved the way we assumed." The word assumed hit harder than any accusation. The millionaire felt heat crawl up his neck. "You told me it was irrelevant," he snapped. "You told me it didn't matter." "It didn't," the attorney replied quickly. "Until the ruling." Across the aisle, his ex-wife sat quietly, her posture relaxed but attentive. She listened to every word, her expression unreadable. Months ago, she would have been shaking in a room like this, overwhelmed by the language, by the authority of men who spoke as if certainty belonged to them. Now, she felt strangely distant from it all, as if she were observing something inevitable rather than participating in it. Her father leaned slightly toward her and murmured, "This is the part where they realize the ground isn't solid." She nodded once. The judge returned, taking her seat without ceremony. The room snapped to tension immediately. She glanced down at the documents before her, then looked up, her gaze settling on the millionaire with a calm that felt far more dangerous than anger. "The court has reviewed the submission," she said, "and the preliminary findings raise serious concerns." The millionaire stood before anyone could stop him. "With respect, Your Honor, this is an ambush. Every relevant asset was disclosed during the divorce trial. Every requirement was met." The judge did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Relevance is not determined by confidence," she replied. "It is determined by jurisdiction and material control." She turned slightly toward the father. "Explain the structure." The father stood again, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not look at the millionaire as he spoke. He addressed the room as if giving a lecture to people who should have known better. The holding arrangement was designed to remain inactive unless a specific legal condition was met, he said. That condition was the finalization of the divorce ruling. A murmur rippled through the room, more pronounced this time. The millionaire's lawyer visibly paled. The judge leaned forward. "You're saying the ruling itself activated the structure?" "Yes," the father replied evenly, "which is why its material relevance could not be assessed prior to that moment." The millionaire shook his head in disbelief. "That's absurd," he said. "You can't hide assets behind technicalities and then claim surprise." The judge's gaze snapped back to him. You will refrain from commentary unless addressed. Silence fell again, thick and oppressive. The judge continued, the court must now determine whether the assets governed by this structure fall within the scope of marital property, or whether prior assumptions led to an incomplete ruling. The word incomplete echoed in the millionaire's mind. His legal victory, the one he had celebrated so openly, now sounded provisional, fragile. He glanced at his lawyers, searching for reassurance, but found only calculation and quiet alarm. This structure was never flagged. One of the attorneys whispered urgently, because it was dormant, because it wasn't producing statements, because no one thought to dig that deep. The millionaire swallowed. He remembered signing documents years ago without reading them closely, trusting that complexity was protection. He had always believed obscurity equaled safety. Now that belief was unraveling in real time. The ex-wife rose slowly, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Every head turned toward her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and surprisingly steady. I didn't ask for this to be handled quietly because I was afraid, she said. I asked because I wanted it handled correctly. The judge regarded her thoughtfully. And you believe this submission corrects an oversight? Yes, she replied. An oversight created by assumption. The judge nodded slowly. Assumptions have no standing here. She looked down at her notes again, then back up. Given the circumstances, the court is suspending the previous ruling, pending a comprehensive review. The millionaire felt the room tilt. Suspending? He repeated, incredulous. On what grounds? On the grounds that the court may not have had full jurisdiction over all materially relevant interests at the time of judgment, the judge replied. His lawyer closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound was not loud, but it was devastating. Clerks began moving immediately, gathering documents, exchanging quiet instructions. Lawyers spoke in hushed tones. The ex-wife collected her things calmly, her father already at her side. They didn't rush. There was no need to. Momentum was no longer on the millionaire's side. He stood frozen for a moment, watching them walk away together. Not victorious, not smug, simply resolved. He tried to speak, to object, to reclaim control through volume or authority, but no one was listening anymore. The room had shifted. The system he trusted, the one he believed he had mastered, had found a fault line he didn't know existed. As the courtroom emptied, the millionaire remained behind, staring at the empty bench where certainty had once sat so comfortably. He understood now too late that money could manipulate process, delay outcomes, and buy silence. But it could not erase truth forever. And the truth, once unearthed, did not care how deeply it had been buried. The hallway outside the courtroom felt unfamiliar, as if its dimensions had shifted while no one was looking. The millionaire walked through it slowly, his footsteps echoing louder than he remembered, each one landing with an odd finality. Earlier, this same corridor had felt like a passage toward celebration. Now it felt like an exit he hadn't planned to take yet. His lawyers trailed behind him, close enough to be present, but far enough to signal that something had changed. They spoke in low, clipped phrases, full of contingency plans and cautious language, but none of it sounded like certainty anymore. It sounded like people trying to keep a structure upright after discovering cracks in the foundation. He stopped near a tall window overlooking the street. Sunlight filtered in, catching the dust in the air, illuminating a city that moved with complete indifference. Cars flowed through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets without looking up. Life went on, unbothered by suspended rulings and overturned assumptions. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. He had built his entire identity on the belief that his wins mattered, that they registered beyond boardrooms and bank accounts. Standing there now, he realized how small even his loudest victories were in the face of a world that never paused for him. For a moment, he considered calling someone. Anyone. A trusted associate. A longtime friend. Someone who would tell him this was temporary, that control could still be reclaimed. He scrolled through his contacts, thumb hovering, then stopped. He didn't know what he would say. For the first time in years, words felt inadequate. Behind him, the courtroom doors opened again. He turned instinctively, and there she was. His ex-wife stepped out quietly, her movements unhurried, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been for months. Her father walked beside her, steady and composed, the briefcase no longer in his hand, its purpose fulfilled. They didn't speak as they walked. They didn't need to. Whatever had been unresolved between them had finally settled into place. Their eyes met. The millionaire braced himself for something sharp. Satisfaction. Vindication. A look that would confirm he had been the villain all along. Instead, what he saw was calm. Not coldness, not triumph. Calm, grounded, and complete. The expression of someone who had stopped needing anything from him. She didn't slow her pace. She didn't stop. She didn't say a word. She simply walked past him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and familiar, a reminder of a life he had once dismissed as inconsequential. Her father followed, offering no glance, no acknowledgement. Not out of disrespect, but because none was needed. They disappeared down the corridor, their footsteps fading until the space felt even larger than before. The millionaire remained by the window, staring at his reflection in the glass. It looked different now. Not weaker, exactly, but exposed. The confidence he had worn so comfortably felt like a costume he no longer knew how to take off. He saw the man he had been during the divorce trial, certain and dismissive, convinced that money and preparation guaranteed control. He saw how wrong that belief had been. Outside, the ex-wife paused briefly before getting into the car. She exhaled, a slow release of breath that felt like the end of a long-held tension. Her father opened the door for her, then waited. "I thought I'd feel something bigger," she said quietly, staring at the street ahead. Her father considered this. "Big emotions announce themselves," he replied. "This wasn't about noise." She nodded, absorbing that. "You knew this would happen." "I knew it was possible," he said. "So I made sure we wouldn't be unprepared." She turned to him, her eyes softening. "Thank you. For not rushing. For not letting me panic." He gave a small nod. Sometimes the most important work happens while everyone else is celebrating. As they drove away, neither of them looked back at the courthouse. There was nothing left for them there. Inside, the millionaire finally pulled himself away from the window. His lawyer approached carefully, choosing his words with more care than usual. "We'll need to reassess everything," he said. "There's still a path forward. It's complicated, but it's not over." The millionaire nodded slowly, but the reassurance didn't land. Not over no longer sounded hopeful. It sounded exhausting. It sounded like a future filled with uncertainty instead of dominance. He dismissed the lawyer with a brief gesture and headed toward the exit alone. That evening, his apartment felt too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of privacy, but the kind that magnified every thought. He poured himself a drink he barely tasted and sat in the dark, replaying the past months in his mind. The filings, the hearings, the way he had dismissed the father as irrelevant, the way he had mistaken silence for weakness at every turn. He saw it clearly now. He hadn't lost in court that day. He had lost the moment he stopped believing consequences applied to him. He had lost when he assumed no one would wait patiently enough to challenge him on his own terms. Across the city, his ex-wife sat at her father's kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug, listening to the familiar sounds of a home that felt steady and safe. For the first time in a long while, her future didn't feel like something she had to fight for. It simply existed, open and unthreatening. The world outside continued as it always did, indifferent and fair in its own quiet way. And somewhere between the courthouse steps and the fading echo of his certainty, the millionaire finally understood that arrogance rarely ends with spectacle. It ends in silence, when no one is left to applaud.